Hey there, friends. This is Dr. David Hall. Today on Church Psychology, Matt and I are going to get into a conversation talking about the tension and process between thinking about personal independence and dependence, which is a huge topic, particularly as it relates to youth development, our own sense of what we can accomplish, trying to find that line between our self-sufficiency as humans, as well as our dependence on God and how that fits into a psychological space. That's what Matt and I are going to get into today. So happy you're going to be joining us. Let's drop into that music.
Welcome to Church Psychology, a podcast of the Negev Institute. We are mental health professionals looking at the intersections of social and behavioral science in the Christian life. Please connect with our free resources in our open community library at churchpsychology.org. We would be grateful if you would follow, like, or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you are finding us, and also leave us a review. As we start, if we are to love the Lord our God with all of our mind, it makes sense to work on our headspace. So let's get to work. Well, welcome everybody to the Church Psychology Podcast. My name is Matt Schoeneman. I'm here with Dr. David Hall. David,
Hi,
good to
Matt.
see you. Hey.
Yeah.
It's not been a while for you and I. We work together, but maybe for our people.
We're on
that have seen
different
us.
floors.
Yeah.
We're on different floors. And so Matt and I will do these recordings, and we record in our offices right now, but we'll kind of run back and forth in between
Welcome to our
takes.
space.
Yeah. And
They see my space more than your space. They see your
I do against the
diploma.
wall. Yeah. And
But-
you got a lot in your office. We do have a feral cat that lives in our neighborhood. And I do think sometimes, for those who are watching this on YouTube, you can see Matt's window and he's on a second story.
Yeah.
But every once in a while, I have this fanciful thought of the cat just kind of peering its feral head over the ledge.
Oh, sweet kitty. He does that in some of the bottom floor ones. So
He does.
you know, who knows what goes on behind me in that window? That would be its own podcast. What goes on behind in the window?
In the window. So Matt, this is what we're going to talk about today. Is something that I know is a passion topic for you. It's something you
and it
talk
relates
about
a lot to feral cats, you know.
In a certain way, it does. In a certain way, it does. So, Let us off. What's our topic? For
Yeah.
today?
We're carrying on the theme that we've had for the past few episodes. And we don't know if we'll continue on this theme after today, but this, in a sense, brings at least this section of this theme to a close. But we're talking about the tension between two things that in some ways both sides have its validity, but how do we hold the balance between them? Because we've already talked about this, but so many aspects of the culture and even in the church, the pendulum swings. And when that swing happens, it doesn't necessarily produce the most health or the most ability to live in step with the Spirit. And so today's topic is one of the tension between independence and dependence. And even as I say that, I wonder if some of you squirm to even think of the word dependence. I know I do to some level. There's a little bit of our American cultural flair that I think even as a man that says I can do all things, on my own. It's that, that passage, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, but it's really just power to do it on my own, and so that's in a way been a lot of how I've viewed my life as I've grown up. And so lately I've wrestled with the concept of dependence and what does that mean? Because I've, as a counselor and psychologist for you, David, there's the term codependence that gets thrown around and it kind of makes people shudder. It's like, I don't want to be codependent. And so anyways, I think it's important that we talk about this tension. How do we live out life? Do we live out life independent or dependent on others? And what's the tension in between those? Because if you listen to any of the past three, or actually all of them now, there's a sense to which you're going to know the answer is that it's somewhere in the middle.
It depends. That's the joke.
Yeah.
That's the joke if you talk to a therapist you ask the question.
We never give you a direct answer. I mean, it's
the
really
answer is always, it depends. And because I know for myself, and I think this is true for a lot of people, that we think about maturation and our sense of growth in life, whether it's spiritually or emotionally, physically, is we're aiming to this point of arrival.
Yeah.
And my goal is to kind of get there. And we see it as kind of this linear progress. And there are aspects of growth that are linear, but not it's not just linear. And Matt and I have talked so much about this idea of so many of the conversations we get into and so many of the topics that are important to us is how to identify things in intention.
Mm.
I mean, we were talking about in our last episode of this concept of agency is this place between control and complete, uh,
Victimization,
yeah,
victimhood.
victimization on one side, and that the best we can understand it from a mental health perspective, from a scriptural perspective, from uh, both is kind of this place in between. And dependence and independence is kind of in that. Like you said, for those in kind of the Western, definitely American mindset, that dependence can feel very reproachable. You shouldn't be dependent.
Yeah.
And there's a lot in the specific psychology in the American like social and national story that reinforces that sense. And I don't think all of it's bad, but like all things, it has its limits. Because ultimately, we live as finite creatures. We inhabit certain physical space, certain physical time. We have certain physical abilities that grow and then eventually diminish.
Yeah.
And that creates a lot of psychological questions and stress. And the other thing I think where this is relevant, the sense of living in Christian community, living as the church. And as we are in an era where abuse of power has been something that's been talked about quite a bit and something Matt and I have already touched on,
Yeah.
the issues of dependence and independence kind of come to fore there. So it just all those things kind of come in and um, we see the tension in our work in families of people that have a hard time, whether it's parents or spouses or people that try to hold on to things too tightly to try to control situations. Uh, People that sometimes feel if they're children, I think of a lot of instances I've worked with in working with families with teenagers, as teenagers are grappling with progressively more independence or desire for independence, how that can be difficult for the family and the
Yeah.
parents may feel rejection in that. So yeah, that's
And
kind of
and
a
it's
yeah,
and a sense even in the family structure where they're like, you cannot be independent on your own. I pay
yeah.
for your house, I pay for your car, all these things that are fair and true. I just think that they find that that's a lot of tension when you talk about the adolescent stages of
Yeah.
growth. And there's some, we can maybe get into this in a minute, but there's some legitimate developmental things to where someone becomes more independent or
Mhm,
longs for independence as they get older. The
mhm,
flip side of that is you get to older ages in life, and you talked about I don't know if you use this word, but the word came to mind was capacity and limitations because I think as I reflect even on my own life journey, and I don't think anybody would probably have said to me, he's prideful or narcissistic, that kind of independence. It was more very like quiet, hidden, like I don't want to ask for help because I don't want to burden somebody kind of independence. That I've learned through age and through just life circumstances that I have major limitations in capacity constraints,
mhm,
that I think that we live in our 20s and 30s in this sense of kind of unrealistic imagination land where I can literally do anything I want. And
mhm,
some of that we promoted to our children that says, you can be whatever you want to be. Well, there are still limitations in this life. So some of that is just, I think, kind of real. You mentioned why this is personal. I think it's because I'm walking through it right now. This struggle of where my independence is falling short because I don't have the capacity to do more.
mhm,
I have to lean on other people now, and that's a hard pill to swallow sometimes.
mhm. Well, and you also walk the journey, Matt, as a parent and
Yeah,
seeing this kind of progress with your
yeah,
children, and so it's a lot of different angles,
yeah,
and, we there's so many. I mean, we could give so many examples of where this will manifest. And the there's famous psychiatrist Milton Erickson, who has also influenced a lot of early family therapy approaches. And one of the things that he would talk about is that in the context of family therapies, that families would present to therapy when they are having difficulty navigating a transition from one phase to another. And so if it's in the context of life phase of children,
Mm.
going from toddler to, school age child to that to preteen to teen to, and it would be families would get stuck in their roles. And it would often be uh covertly or sometimes overtly a teenager is trying to push into a new role and the parents are trying to equalize with that. And so that's this difficulty and in that. But as you talk about the sense of limitations, I joke with people, I feel pretty decent at this phase of my career as a therapist. I'm a pretty good therapist. You do not want to hire me as your accountant.
Y-
Um, I'm not a good landscaper.
Yeah.
I am not like,
No, I've
and
tried that. That's not works. Yeah.
well, and it's a phase in life that you reach this. I mean, I remember one of the things that struck me in this was in 2012, which at the time of recording is over 10 years ago. I was watching the Olympics in London. I wasn't in London. But I was watching it, and the Olympics were happening in London. And there was a swimmer that was competing who was from Matt and my community in Knoxville, Tennessee. He a swimmer named Davis Tarwater, and they were talking about at the time how old he was. And at the time he was 28. I remember the commentaries that now Michael Phelps, the next Olympics, Michael Phelps competed at 31, but that was quite old. But this is in 2012. They were talking about and I remember the commentator saying yeah, Tarwater's really long in the tooth to be here. And I at the time was 31. And I remember thinking the thought struck me is I'm too old to be a competitive Olympic swimmer. Now, I've never swam competitively. I had not been working towards that goal.
But you were so hopeful.
It was
One
just
day.
more it
One
entered that
day.
was the first time it had been spoken in a way that, my age had limited me in something,
Yeah.
where I had registered it, I am now getting to ages where physically just whereas when you're 13, 14, you're like, "Who knows? The world's wide open.
Right.
Maybe I'll be this, maybe I'll be that," and
Mm.
there's a sense of diminishing possibilities, and that becomes a means of dependence. So anyway, we're what we've said so far, we kinda just wanna lay the gravel
Yeah.
of the initial foundation of this tension point between dependence and independence,
Yeah.
and it's good and bad. As Christians, it teaches us important deep humility when we recognize our dependence.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we also, similar to what we talked about before, we wanna encourage people in their sense of agency, because ultimately, we believe that as beings created in the image of God, given, uh, the kind of the command to kind of go out and take action in this world that we inhabit,
Mhm.
that there is a sense of at least delegated independence we're given.
Yeah.
And how do we live in that tension
Mm.
from a psychological standpoint? So, yeah.
Yeah. We do this comparison often, and feel free to, move the conversation away from this if you don't feel like talking about it, David. But we talk about this over the past couple times is there's a difference, or there's been some shifting
Mhm.
as it relates to how the culture kind of speaks into this, and then how the church does, like church culture versus culture. Um, and I'll say this first and just kind of see what your thoughts are. But I've seen, actually, I think, kind of a flip flop at times between kind of the world, so to speak, and its which way would they lean. And I think that, like, the world has some kind of interesting way that, through movies and culture and media and all this stuff, that it pressed for a while that independent mind frame, especially, well, and I'll speak for men for a second. It's just, the John Wayning effect. Like, so
Mhm.
you ride alone off into the sunset, and you've just taken care of all the bad guys, but you're just on your own.
Yeah.
Um, but I feel like even to that end, there's a little bit of like, maybe over the past 10 years or so, kind of a sense of dependence that is formed to where, the culture's more in a sense, I don't know if longing's the word or even kind of pushing or forcing people to be like, you have to support me. Like you have to lift me up. We talked about victimization and
Mhm.
victimhood mentality in our last episode. And it feels like that victimhood mentality kind of calls out for dependence, but it's almost like a forced dependence,
Yeah.
like over the years. On the flip side, I see the church be probably the best form of community and kind of this interdependent um, when it first formed. But over the years, especially in the American church, I won't call out specific denominations, but some that I grew up in, there's a real sense of like, you share all of your good stuff with me. Like God did this for me and did this, but pray for this, but it's an unspoken prayer request, right? Like it's that kind of sense of, I'm going to just give you a little bit of my need of you to step into my life, but I'm not really going to bring you in because I want to be able to do this on my own and present you this great picture.
Yeah,
So
that is an
that's the
yeah.
flip of where, and I think that the church has tried to rectify that lately. I've seen it in other churches and, where
Mm.
I'm at now, but man, there's a real problem of independence as it relates to, if we call that a bad thing in the sense of this conversation, but in the church being a struggle to find the right balance of these things.
Yeah, what you talking about, Matt, makes me think about, another way of talking about that angle of dependence is also vulnerability and how we try to really protect ourselves from feeling too vulnerable and exposed.
Yeah.
And there's so many directions could talk about this, but I wanna think about it specifically as you bring it up in the sense of, like, church culture
Yeah.
and how both of these things, desire for independence and dependence, come into play in how it I think it from an outsider, and I mean this just as much as a question too, because I've not worked in vocational ministry where you have,
Right.
is I think on one end, people are very hesitant to commit to life in a community at times. Oftentimes, people can be these kind of permanent shoppers of churches and church community,
Mm.
and it's often very driven, I think, by a consumeristic mindset
Yeah.
of how is this, whether is this pastor preacher really engaging, or what does the worship service feel like, and does this meet my taste?
Yeah. There's a
And
common like Christian vernacular of like, did it feed me? Like that.
did if
Did
yeah,
it fit?
am I being fed?
Yeah.
And
That's it.
as soon as I'm not, then this idea of moving on, and even I've talked with a lot of clergy that are friends of mine of the hurt they feel with congregants kind of ghosting them, just disappearing without comment and out like, and oftentimes these could be people that weren't just peripheral, but pretty like
Yeah.
visible.
And invested in that person's life,
Yeah, but
that
then
pastor's life.
yeah, and so and oftentimes there's this sense of like there's a lot written about right now in the developmental journey of things of where people struggle with, um, commitment
Mm.
and how commitment represents a sense of I'm giving up my independence. There was a great podcast episode, Matt, that you and I were talking about, and make a note to put this in our show notes, but for, uh, Anthony Bradley's
Mhm.
episode on the boy crisis, which is amazing resource, but one of the Anthony B. Bradley's professor at, in, Manhattan, talks is an ethicist and talks on sociology as it relates to church culture, among other topics. Brilliant mind, highly recommend his work. But he is very concerned and is speaking and writing a lot about right now about the effects of um, kind of the cultural incubation for young men.
Yeah.
And one of the things he highlighted in this episode that I'm referencing that Matt and I recently went through is this fear of commitment. Because I think this commitment, it's I'm eliminating my options. I'm ending some of my independence. I want to keep my independence, so I stay from committing and I keep myself from intimacy.
Well,
I think that
here's a caveat that I would give to that because I had a recent conversation even today with another group of people, and there was this concept of this that is not inaccurate, but I think that there's a deeper layer that shows what the true fear is. And it may even play into the aspects of why we lean independent versus dependent. There's a sense to which the fear of commitment is actually driven by more of a fear of failure. If I commit to
Mhm.
this and then don't follow through, what does that make me?
Yeah.
And so I wonder if when we talk about, especially as we're talking about his research related more towards boys and why men are struggling in this sense, if that fear is more of the pressing core,
Mhm.
that heat under the surface that's bubbling it up.
Mhm. Yeah. And so that's on one side, I think, of the struggle for towards independence and where that can be problematic
Yeah.
in church life. And here's the talk about the overdependence, and this relates to what you were referencing of the sense of related to the victimhood sort of thing, but like I'm kind of calling out external support to justify me, not to question me,
Hmm.
not to, we talk about this idea, I want you to support me, but we want the support to come without any sort of accountability
Yeah.
of what am I supporting? Like, well, do you support me or not? But it is looking, and it's a similar view of I think people look at particularly the staff or leadership in different churches. It's a similar thing to the consumeristic mindset that really comes into a lot of church life. Am I being fed? And that's the idea of it. But it's the expectation, particularly for the people up front, that like it's the role of you as the pastor to do this. We need to be doing more on fill in the blank on the topic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've been part of the church community I've been in now for 15 years, and I've been in the same church community for as long as I've lived in. I live in my hometown, but I spent a season away for college and things like that. But since I moved back in my late 20s, I've been in the same community, and I've talked with people in it. And I remember one conversation I had years ago with a friend who they were saying they wanted to see the church do more of X. And it was specifically of talking about supporting this particular ministry in the community, that the church was doing some involvement in that, but this person feels like, I feel like they need to be doing more. And I looked to him and I said, well, you make it happen.
Mhm.
And it was this idea of that he didn't see himself, at least in that conversation. He wasn't the church. The church was the paid staff or the identified people
Yeah.
up front.
Yeah.
And that's where it's this dependent, like, I'm dependent on you, the pastor or the children's ministry director or the youth leader or something like that to do this.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of passive in this process, whereas that's not what we're called to be.
Right.
And so again, this is a lot of callback to our conversation on the previous episode about agency of, but I think there's a passivity that even happens how people participate in church life that represents some of that dependence
Hmm.
of in that. So
Yeah.
that's what I got to say about that.
I appreciate what you say about that. I as we talk through this and attempt to find the balance between the two, um, because on one hand, just keeping with the church, there's a sense to which, and I want to come back to something as it relates to our relationship to God, even in a little bit. But um, I read somewhere that like God has made us dependent um, on three things, and I would put it in the show notes, but I can not tell you. Remember this, but on God Himself, on God's Word, and God's people.
Mm,
And on the first two, I read that and I was like, "Oh yeah, for sure." And then the third one, I was like, "Oof, what?"
mm,
Like there's still that kind of burn in you of that. And so to find the balance is to recognize that, to some level, as in our belief, David and I, and how we believe God made us, I think He made us with the need of these three things in our life, but it has to be in a way of balance. And so I guess let's jump into the concept of this balance and holding the tension, David. And I think you're going to bring in some psychological concepts and maybe models of that, even developmental models. But yeah, let's just talk through that that balance, and how do we offer to the people listening, what are ways they can walk in this?
Well, what we're gonna talk about too, and these are some established psychological models of talking about development and as it relates to things like dependence and independence.
Yeah.
And that there is this developmental arc or journey that people are on. And if you are in a church community setting, you're ideally seeing people in different ages. But there's different chronological ages and there's different emotional ages. And I think what can be interesting is that you can have somebody who may be older as far as their years, but where they are in their
Physical years.
maturity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
versus developmental years. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that could be some of the things that kind of but yeah, this is something I teach out of a lot and I personally find interesting, but you have, a a major person in developmental psychology in the 20th century was a Danish psychologist named Erik Erikson, and he's most famous in the psychotherapy world for his stages of psychological development, and there were multiple phases, but all of them as Matt and I have kind of talked about these things in dichotomy and tension. He identifies each of his stages as something versus something, a point of tension. And the one that we feel is most interesting is talking about like in adolescence, because this is where the striving towards independence from dependence in a developmental arc happens the most. Though you can have very old adolescents sometimes, but Erickson talked about this stage as one of his middling stages, but talking about the concept is fidelity in it. Fidelity, the sense of commitment or loyalty to something. But in that, it relates to, he calls identity on one side versus role confusion. Who am I, and how do I shift into that? And the main question for somebody in this phase who's walking through this is, who am I and what can I be? If I'm talking about teenagers in this phase, they're very concerned. This is often my work. I'm walking with parents as they're trying to see their teenagers. Is they're very concerned of how they appear to others, whether that's peers or even adults. They're trying to figure out how to establish an independent self that has value and meaning within the world they inhabit socially, and that world can be in their peer realm, it could be different peer realms of peers at school or in a sports setting, their life within the church,
Yeah.
and how to have a distinct role that has kind of grown more independent from where they were before. There's the desire to be on your own. There's the desire to make your own decisions. Oftentimes that represents a point of tension with the parents of how much do I give them?
Yeah.
What's appropriate? That's probably one of the most common conversations I have with parents is them trying to understand what level of independence should I give them?
Mm.
Because to establish a role involves a certain level of independence and kind of struggling towards that. But that often represent and the problem is you have teenagers struggling towards something, but they don't often know what they're struggling to.
Yeah.
They there's the desire to like grow and be different, but the world is oftentimes giving them these different labels or different ways to kind of talk about an identity
Mm.
that may or may not be ultimately true or ultimately fruitful.
Yeah.
Uh, and then parents struggle with, how do I recognize the limitation? Because ultimately a teenager may desire this, but they may not have the emotional or intellectual capacity to it's amazing, I find, like, I loved that I was able to start driving at 16, and I was a
Mm.
pretty good driver, I was pretty responsible. I will say, as a psychologist in my 40s, it's hard for me to look back and think, like, I get it.
Yeah.
I'm not recommending we change the driving age necessarily, but man,
Yeah.
I was in a lot of cars where a lot of stupid things were done automotively as a young person. But for me, what I
Just
loved.
envisioning all of what could have been. Like,
Yeah, and it was just and I'm not even talking about, like, immoral in the ways of just like, just poor automotive decisions. And I may have gotten up on two wheels more than once.
Yeah.
I had a very top heavy car that was prone to flipping. I never flipped it, but the make was
Yes.
prone to
Yeah.
flip. But I never did that. But I got up on two wheels. But I wanted independent, and that's the thing. That's what I loved about being able to be a driver as a young man.
Yeah.
Is that
But here,
represented so much independence. Church Psychology is a production of the Negev Institute, a research, resource, and teaching initiative that aims to provide Christian communities with practical education and consulting to faithfully speak to our needs in mental health, relational science, and human habit and behavior. A great way to support Negev is to start a free membership in our open community library at churchpsychology.org, and then stay connected with our email newsletter to hear about new classes, publications, live forums, and in-person events. Again, you can find all that at churchpsychology.org.
it's so interesting though, again, to the culture shift. I don't know how many, teenagers whether I see them in practice or just have heard stories outside of here, but that are not as eager to drive as
Mhm.
maybe you and I were. And now I feel like two old men talking about back in the day, but like
Back in the
back in my day, there was nothing out here. There was this sense of like, I was similar to you. It's like the day I got my license, I like, boom, out the door, like went to my friend's house. Thought it was the coolest thing ever that
Mhm.
I could do that, and now like guys or kids in general are waiting till they're 18 later, just getting driven around everywhere. And so it's the sense of like that drive isn't as present even for teenagers now.
I have
That
2
kind of
points on that because I've looked at
shift to
this.
dependence. Yeah.
I've looked at that. So I haven't been able to do controlled research on this, but I've looked at the literature and I have hypotheses for these that I feel pretty strong about.
Mhm.
One is anxiety. That we know that anxiety is much higher for adolescents now than it has been in previous decades.
Yep.
And I think the idea of driving and being vulnerable in that way can create, and as I've talked with teenagers that are resistant to getting their driver's licenses,
Yeah.
that's
I can see that.
often comes
Yep.
up as anxiety. Here's the other bit, and it's the nature of smartphone technology, because there is the drive to like, when do I get my first phone? And what does that mean?
Mm.
And I think what it is that represents independence. Because what's happening when they get their phone is they are getting, for the most part, this fairly unmonitored social world that they can inhabit.
Yeah. Unlimited access, basically.
Yeah, and even for families that I think exercise wisdom and setting boundaries and things like that,
Yeah.
but basically that becomes my autonomy. For me, because that was the same thing for me. When I got my driver's license, the first thing I did was went over to my friend's house, and he only lived, like, a few miles away. But the fact that I could go over and see him without having to ride and getting like, I had the like, yes, I'm just gonna go over there. I had the independence to initiate my own social world differently.
Yeah.
And smart technology allows that because you're on, and because it's the classic thing of the parent driving teenagers around there in the back seat, and they're not talking to each other, they're texting, and maybe each other, or maybe they're on the same thread on the social media app or things like that. But
Hmm.
I think it's because they are exerting their because the way I see teenagers make the case for their need for a smartphone, it's similar to, I remember
Yeah.
making, like, the case to my dad of why I needed a car,
Yeah.
and
I
it's
think that's well
similar,
said.
and it's like, well, it's just changed, it's shifted to the smartphone, and
Yeah.
because I do think if smart because I came of age without smartphones, and I think if smartphones didn't exist right now, or that wasn't a thing for teenagers, I think we would see it differently possibly. So, yeah, that's my hypothesis. I think it would hold up to research, but it's
No, I can see that for sure. I think that technology's really impacted that. I would say this, just to kind of jump back to the developmental models. I wanted to share for a minute a way that was given to me that helped me kind of put it into language that was a little bit less psychological, kind of lingo. One of my mentors, a man named Dr. Kevin Huggins. He's used, he's researched Erickson's stuff and it's been really good, but he kind of broke it down into stages or decades of life, and that
Mhm.
the first 10 years of life, the child is seeking the top question in their world, or what they're seeking from others is the question of, am I good?
Mm.
Um, and so you'll see that through how they interact with their parents, their coaches, their friends, trying to get that validation that they're good in some way. And good can be very kind of stretched, is that even as a bad child, like, or negative behavior child, they're looking for something that kind of acknowledges, okay, it's almost identity to some level. Um, the second 10 years of life, so 10 to 20, so to speak, is they're looking for the essential question that they're trying to answer is, am I free? The problem is, if a child cannot answer the first question well, then both questions are at battle with each other throughout adolescence. So the reason I think a lot of parents of teenagers are frustrated is because they're seeing their child pull away from them, which in a sense is a natural developmental stage of autonomy, as we use that word, but basically freedom. I want to be able to make choices on my own. I want to kind of figure out life on my own. And to some level, I think it's healthy to grow those muscles. But if they don't have a central question of, am I good, answered correctly, um, they struggle a lot within the teenage years, because their freedom behaviors become more risky because they're looking for more identity formation, if you will.
Mm.
So, if you're a parent listening or work with teenagers, that I think kind of asking those questions of like, what are these behaviors seeking out? Um, might be a way to help them figure out better ways to help answer some of those questions. Because parents, let me just say this, and I'm going to struggle with this when my kids become teenagers, but there has to be some level of freedom that is given. They have to stretch the boundaries to some level to have healthy development through their years.
Mhm.
But you have freedom to set boundaries on that. Even with the smartphone, we're talking about that. One person I was talking to, I loved how you framed this, but he's like, it's like kids driving Mario Kart, like unless it's like Rainbow Road, they fall off. But like there's a sense to which there's you have this path, and wherever you are in the path between these two boundaries, you have freedom to drive as fast, slow, go left or right, but you can't go across the boundary.
Mm.
To some level, to give them that sense of that, I think even comes back to the concept of this podcast, is there's a little bit to which they have independence, they have freedom to make choice, they have agency, but they are dependent on you to set the boundaries for them to make good choices, or as best choices as they can, and just have success moving forward. So anyway, I thought that was helpful framework to kind of maybe use, I don't know, simpler language is the right way to put it, but just ways that it helped me understand this concept a little bit deeper.
No, I love kind of what Kevin Huggins unpacks in that, and, Dr. Kevin Huggins, author of Parenting Adolescence, which was a very important book, but it came out early '90s, and Matt and I recently discovered videos of that, and that was,
We will put those in the show notes.
we will put those in the show notes too because,
No, he would kill me. He
I
would
mean,
he would take me outside.
I think it would be
But I
fun,
will put a link to his book.
yeah.
I don't know if it's still in print, but you can at least look up some of that stuff. Yeah.
It's just, I it's what stuff looked like in the early '90s, just a little different, like what we
Yeah.
chose to wear and our style and things like that. But anyway, the to want we talk about kind of there's a normalization from a mental health professional standpoint. There's a normalization of teenage rebellion that we often want to give families.
Mm.
Um, I do think, though, it's also important to do justice to the aspects of safety and even kind of parent anxiety that
Yeah.
it kind of comes in because I have colleagues I know that oftentimes lean a little too much into, well, they need to have these freedom to make these decisions, and I disagree with that as a wholesale thing. There's a reason that we don't let 16-year-olds make any number of legal decisions. I'm a firm believer. I believe 18. I don't believe an 18-year-old. Now, I'm going to get on a soapbox for a second. I don't believe an 18-year-old should be able to commit to debt.
Mm.
I don't think an 18-year-old should be able to get a credit card independently. I don't think an 18-year-old should sign up on student loans independently. I don't think, because here's the deal developmentally. I realize we have to pick some age for certain things. And 18 is a fairly universal across a lot of societies in the world of kind of this is the point of adulthood.
Right.
And there's some reason for that. But developmentally, in a brain sense, the human brain doesn't finish its developmental journey until like the mid-20s, mid to late 20s for males.
It's
And
getting longer than that.
yeah,
I think they even said like early 30s in more recent research.
yes, and that's, and there's an interesting aspect of what social things kind of affect it, but the last part to develop is the part of the brain that handles a lot of decision making and impulse control.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as we're dealing with things like student debt crisis and like there's a lot to it, and I could not make wise decisions about taking on debt when I was 18. Part of it, your even sense of future when you're 18, because like I'm never going to turn 30. 30 is this distant thing in the future. And so I will burden 30-year-old me with any number of things because he'll figure it out. He'll be a grown up.
Yeah. 30-year-old me hated
Yeah, I hated
18-year-old.
18-year-old me and the decisions that could be made. So
Right.
I bring that up because when I am as a therapist sitting with a family and I'm talking with a 14, 15-year-old who's saying, they shouldn't tell me what to do in this. It's my life. I should be able to kind of get, this, and like they can't make this decision for me. And I'm an advocate of both sides. Often in my family therapy work, I'm an advocate for the teenager, for the parents, but I'm also an advocate for the parents to the teenager.
Yeah.
Like I should make this decision on my own. And I'm like, legally you can't. And I can tell you from a psychological basis, I wouldn't put, you're not a very safe bet.
Yeah.
Because what you do, and this isn't just about your parents winning and you losing. This is about future you. This is about present you wants to make a decision, but future you is going to have to live with some of these decisions. And
Yeah.
how does that, and particularly when you're talking, there's certain decisions that you want to make now that may have more or less impact on future you. And then there's a reason that all societies to different degrees, are built on this concept of there's a certain level of agency that agency is doled out over time.
Yeah.
Because there are issues that we see. I can't tell you how many individuals I've seen as a counselor, Matt, and you probably have your own stories, who lived in family structures that were pretty restricted. And then all of a sudden they crossed this hard threshold into adulthood, whether that was them going away to college or maybe even later for some of them.
Yeah.
But they went from having very little independence.
Yeah.
And the concept of what you were talking about, the concept of what defined good for their family was continued dependence on parents or things like that.
Well,
And they hit this.
it's equilibrium within the family structure.
Yeah.
Is good. The individual person doesn't really, and I've talked to some people about this, is the downside of that is that with all these rules and regulations, this, rigid system, so to speak, is that they weren't ever fully seen for who they were.
Mhm.
It was just, what could they do to make the system look good? And, that's extreme examples. I don't want to villainize parents necessarily, but there's a sense to which you have on that side this over dependence that then creates struggle to find independence within the structure. Then on the other side, you have disengaged families who don't have any rhythm or rules or structure. It creates quick independence of an adolescent, but they have no ability to relate well to their peers or future family once they move down the line of age. And so there's no ability to have close, deep, meaningful not no ability, but limited ability to have deep, meaningful relationships with other people. And so I think that even family systems mindsets of how can we find the balance of in between creating structures in our home that promote high dependence versus high independence, but is there an in between that holds the tension that allows them to know that, hey, you're structured, you can't go past these boundaries, but you can. Why don't you tell me what you want to do in that situation? Like, let's see what, like, in creating environments to where there's that balance between the two. So these are family systems that we're talking about. It's not even about the individual that, we
Yeah.
first talked about as it relates to this, but I like where this part has gone in the conversation because I wonder if, the parents out there that are listening, they're like, how do I structure this? It's not even just like my own journey
Mhm.
of independence versus dependence. It's now I've got to think about my kids. Like, so yeah, it's a lot, but
Yeah. Well, as we, one of the things is as Matt and I are getting in the rhythm of recording these episodes that I'd like to kind of have as we kind of reach the end of different episodes is like kind of practical takeaways. Like
mm,
what are the implementables in this?
yep.
What are the tools? And I'll give you one of mine because just to warn you now, if you're kind of new to us at this point, you're gonna probably hear a certain broken record in this, which is we're gonna talk a lot about like tension and balance, and it depends because there's it's one of the reasons why Matt and I get paid as much as we do per hour to do therapy, because these answers are hard. If
Yeah.
it was just an all or nothing answer, you could go to Google and you
Well,
wouldn't have
that's
to
true.
pay
That's true.
therapist.
Yeah.
And
Or if I had the answer, I could make a lot of money. Like I could just,
sure, but it's just it's not it's because we're walking these balancing acts constantly,
yeah.
and I don't know an escape from that.
Mm.
And I believe that this is a tension that we're called to live in. But I'll give you one of my metaphors I give to talk about families in this developmental sort of thing, and some practical things in that is I say um, that being the parent of an adolescent, you're constantly, whether you choose to or not, you're constantly losing control to a certain
Mm.
degree. But my expression is uh, being the parent of an adolescent is like becoming the Queen of England. Your power over time becomes much less actual than it is symbolic. You become a constitutional monarch in the process, and your powers become progressively more limited. Sometimes just practicality. I give the example that when you have a 5-year-old and your 5-year-old is resistant to your will, you have the ability to pick up that 5-year-old and strap him in his car seat. Now, it's amazing how much children can make themselves heavier in your arms when they choose to be.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
It's
that's
like
some
70 pounds more than they really are. I
it
don't,
really are. It's just but their desire to not cooperate in the situation can make them heavier, but you still have the ability to pick them up, and it doesn't matter if they're screaming or failing, and put them in their car seat and buckle them in and things like that. You can do that.
yeah.
When they're 10, that gets a lot harder.
Mm.
When they're 15, sometimes you may lose that one in that, like, and so there's
Well,
this
that and law enforcement is
in law
close.
enforcement, it becomes
So,
like the amount of physical force you have to put on that situation becomes different,
yeah.
and so regardless of how you do physical discipline, regardless of how you kind of like, there is a limit. It's progressively more limited. Your child, as they move through adolescence, has more intellectual capacity to thwart your will if they so desire. One of the things about watching little kids is most little kids are not very good at, like, hiding their misdeeds. Um,
They think they are.
they think they are, but
It's
it's
so
not.
funny. Mm.
But older they get, the more, and so you lose that, whether you want to or not, you lose that. And so you are constantly in negotiation, constantly. And I started this episode talking about we look for a rival. We look for, it's like, when am I gonna get to this place where this is done? And the truth is, I don't know that. Like, I'm a man in my 40s, and I still feel I'm being parented by my parents in different ways. Not in a dependent sort of way, but I still look to my parents, as I have a close relationship with them, for counsel and for advice and things like that. They have a very different role in my life,
Yeah.
but it's constantly being renegotiated. What it is in this phase of my life was different than it was 10 years ago. It was different than it was 10 years before that. And it and there are parts of it that things will get easier at certain moments. I talk to parents when they move out of the young kid phase, and they talk about all of a sudden the kid has the ability to feed themselves, and what the game changer that is, that, like, I can eat at the same time as my child.
Yeah.
Like, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And, like, you different things gain, and so having the mindset that, like, it's a constant negotiation, and you will mess it up at times. Good parenting is not perfect parenting. In fact, perfect parenting in a lot of ways is bad parenting. Your kids need to see you make mistakes and apologize and make corrections and things like that. That's healthy, that's good.
Yeah.
They need that
There's a
example.
there's a concept of with couples work that talks about rupture and repair. And I think I work with a lot of couples. This is relating to parenting, but where there's this, I don't know if it's spoken, but an expectation that our relationship can be perfect because we don't face conflict ever.
Mm,
Um, when in reality, conflict is needed within the relationship to develop depth within your relationship. And so conflict will produce rupture because we are imperfect beings. But when there's quick repair after rupture, that's even a deepening layer of our intimacy with one another. And so it's almost to say that rupture and repair is needed in a relationship to deepen the relationship.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean to cut you off from your
Well, but
bullet points, but
but it just to summarize this idea that you're constantly gonna be negotiating it, constantly
yeah,
restructuring it. You will mess up, but
yeah,
it's the willingness to engage in the process
yeah,
and realizing that we are constantly going to be reminded of our dependence on people,
yeah,
on God, on community, on family, on friends, coworkers,
yeah,
and some of us will really seek to cut ourselves off from that, but it leads to a hollow life. And at the same point, I think God desires our increased, not independence as against our ultimate dependence on Him, but I think God desires our desire for adventure, to kind of to bound out in different ways into the spaces that He gives us. Because I think there's a desire for God for us to be co-workers with Him in His plans. I think that's the arc of Scripture all throughout, of the participation of God's people in God's plan. That doesn't mean ultimately we're steering the boat,
yeah,
but He desires us to be part of the crew.
yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a passage that I reflect on as it relates to this, and it's John 15, where Jesus is talking about being the true vine. I'll just read it for a second. But in verse 4, he says, "Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me." And then further, he talks about um, in end of verse 9 and into 10, he says, "Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you,
Mhm,
and that your joy may be full." So, two things I want to point out as it relates to our own individual dependence versus independence is that we are naturally dependent. And I said this earlier, but I think we were even created to be dependent on him and what he provides for us. And so it's not a passive dependence, because there is an active sense of two ways. If you are a branch, in two ways that you have to lean in. On one end is, how do I abide in Christ? And I think there are practices that we can do to, like, no one can make you, this is, getting into spiritual disciplines necessarily, but no one can make you read your scripture. No one can make you pray. No one can make you take the Lord's Supper. No one can make you seek solitude even.
mhm,
Those are, you have to choose. This is the agency piece where you choose to do things that abide in his love. On the
mhm,
other end, you don't have to produce fruit, but that's the outward expression of what God is doing within you, is the sense of, I can do the fruits of the spirit, which are, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and show these things to the world around me and treat others in a certain way. So I think that Scripture for me has always been a good alignment of independence versus dependence, of what I've been asked to do, but where my power comes from. And so maybe that could just be something that you, after you've listened to this, just reflect on as you read the scripture of how do I abide in his love and then can respond from that? Because I think that's the balance of dependence and independence as a believer.
Mm, that's good.
So
I wanna end on that because
yeah,
that
sure.
was that was great.
Preach the message.
Um, yeah, preach. So,
Well, David, thank you for your words as always, and for all of you out there that have listened or watched online. We're grateful for you coming alongside us in this journey, and we look forward to bringing more to you soon. So until then, we'll
yeah.
see you soon.
See ya.
Thank you again for being a part of our latest episode of Church Psychology. If you have enjoyed it, we hope that you will share this episode with others in your life. And please do remember to follow, like, and/or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you're finding us, and leave us a review. We look forward to connecting with you again soon.